In October 2020, 22-year-old film student Ethan Cole vanished from his apartment in a quiet Ohio college town. When police searched the premises 2 days later, they found no signs of a struggle, no blood, and the front door securely locked from the inside. The physical evidence left behind immediately contradicted itself. Investigators found his smartphone sitting on the living room table. The device was entirely unresponsive, its screen permanently frozen at exactly 2:06 a.m. Yet building security cameras recorded a physical impossibility. At that exact same minute, 2:06 a.m., the cameras captured a young man identical to Ethan, calmly stepping out of his apartment and walking down the hall. If the securely locked room and the untouched phone indicate the real Ethan Cole never left his apartment, investigators had to ask a deeply unsettling question. What exactly was captured on those cameras? To understand how this happened, we have to look at the 49 minutes leading up to his disappearance. The evidence suggests this window of time acted as a localized temporal anomaly, a closed-loop incubation chamber. The timeline begins at 1:10 a.m. on October 17th. Ethan was walking back to his apartment after a small, uneventful house party off campus. As he turned onto his street, he noticed a man in a dark hoodie standing across the road. The figure was completely motionless, offering zero reaction as Ethan slowed down to observe him. Ethan eventually dismissed it and went inside. He locked his front door, engaged the deadbolt, dropped his keys on the table, and checked his phone. The time was exactly 1:17 a.m. As he walked toward his bedroom, he encountered the first anomaly. He heard 3 slow, deliberate knocks. They weren't coming from the front door, but from inside the structural wall of his hallway. This diagram shows the 49-minute timeline we are investigating, starting with the deadbolt locking at 1:17 a.m. and ending at 2:06 a.m. At that exact endpoint, Ethan woke up in his bed, not gradually, but violently, as if someone had physically forced his eyes open. He stepped out of his bedroom to investigate the silence in the apartment. As he watched, the deadbolt on his front door slowly turned with a soft click, unlocking by itself, and the door creaked open to reveal empty darkness outside. From that darkness, an intruder stepped inside. The entity was unnaturally tall, with slightly elongated limbs. Its movements were jarring and stiff, as if it had not yet figured out the physical mechanics of walking. The entity used this first 49-minute window as a baseline measurement to test the physical constraints of Ethan's environment. This schematic illustrates what happened next. Ethan gasped awake, his phone reading 1:17 a.m. The attack triggered a temporal reset, trapping his consciousness. He tried to break the pattern. Across dozens of variations, he hid, stayed awake, and sprinted outside. Every attempt ended the exact same way, a reset back to 1:17 a.m. Looking from the entity's perspective reveals a specific function. The loop was a controlled learning environment, using the repetition to map Ethan's behavioral responses. With every reset, the intruder's physiology improved. The stiff, unnatural gait it displayed during the first encounter gradually smoothed out into a fluid human stride. Eventually, it achieved an auditory breakthrough. Stepping through the door, the entity finally spoke, mimicking a distorted version of Ethan's voice. The entity told him, "You're learning." When Ethan asked what it was, it replied, "You are." With those 2 words, the entity showed it was no longer just watching Ethan, it was beginning to mirror him. Shortly after, the parameters of the anomaly began to shift. The knocks arrived earlier. It materialized faster. It gathered enough data, outgrowing the loop's rules. The loop acted as a systematic stress test. By repeatedly exposing Ethan to the same moments of fear, the entity mapped his unique reactions until it could perfectly replicate his behavioral code. Exhausted by hundreds of failed attempts to change the outcome, Ethan finally stopped running. He stood in the center of his hallway, perfectly still, waiting for the deadbolt to unlock and the door to open one last time. The entity that walked in was no longer a faceless silhouette. It possessed a flawless physical replication of Ethan Cole's face, identical in every detail, except for its eyes, which were entirely hollow and pitch black. The entity simply said, "It's time." With the replication complete, The structural integrity of the localized anomaly collapsed, and the physical walls of the apartment dissolved into darkness. 2 days later, the real world encountered the sterile aftermath of this event. Police found an empty room with no signs of violence. They filed a standard missing persons report. The temporal loop didn't simply close, it succeeded in its function, and it left behind a persistent environmental residue. To this day, tenants in that building occasionally wake up in the dead of night to the sound of 3 slow knocks coming from inside the walls, waiting to pull the next subject into the loop.